I had a lot of spiritual experiences growing up as a child, seeing things, knowing things, feeling things, things like that. I think my parents must have realized, at least on some level, what was going on with me because I remember my mom bought me a copy of a book by John Edward, who was really popular at the time. But in the small town that I grew up in, there weren't a lot of spiritually minded people. There weren't people like me or people that could guide me or mentor me or anything like that. And the internet wasn't a thing back then. So all of that stopped, all those experiences stopped to the best of my recollection when I started school and came back again when I was a teenager, probably about 13 or 14. I started working at a place that was very haunted and had a lot of experiences there, which put me on a journey to figure out what's going on with me, or am I crazy? And I suppose maybe the verdict's still out on that one, but I digress. Anyway, I graduated high school. I moved away to go to college. I moved about 2 hours away from where I grew up. And right after I had moved there, this is going to date me a little bit, but I was on MySpace, if you remember MySpace. I saw a posting on there for a mediumship development class that was happening there locally in town, and it was happening that night, and it only cost $5. So we didn't even have GPS back then. I remember printing out my little MapQuest directions, and I got lost, and I finally found where I was supposed to go, and I sort of had to force myself to go inside because I'm kind of shy by nature. But I went in and I figured out who was in charge of that class, and I sat as far away from him as I possibly could. I just wanted to observe and be left alone. Honestly, I don't even remember what that class was about, but there was a time at the end where we would all meditate and share a message with the group or an individual if we got one. And I did get a message for somebody that night, but when it came to be my turn, I was too scared to give that message, too scared to say anything. So I said, I pass. I pass. I didn't get anything. Well, the teacher, his name was Mike, and I remember him looking right at me and he said, I don't believe you. In fact, what's your name? And I said, my name is Justin. He said, you just moved here, didn't you? I said, yes, I did, a couple of days ago. Then he said, there's a gentleman who's stepping in with you. His name is Lewis. Well, that's when my mouth fell open because Lewis was my grandfather. He passed away before I was born. I never met him, but I knew that was his name. And then he said, there's also a lady who's stepping in who wants to give you a big hug. She's holding a quarter, like the coin, a quarter, in her hand, and her name is Bessie. And I'm like thinking to myself, oh my gosh, Bessie was my great grandmother, and I did know her early in my life, and she would always try to give me money. My mom never would let her, so we came up with a little system where she would take a quarter and hide it underneath, or a couple of quarters and hide it underneath the tablecloth at her kitchen table. That way I could just reach my hand in there and get my quarter, and nobody would be none the wiser. Anyway, he said next something that was kind of odd at the time. He said, there's another man here. I'm not quite sure who he is, but he's telling me that his last name is White. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know anybody by that name. I was trying to think, was it a neighbor, a family friend, somebody my parents worked with? I came up short, so I told him I don't know who that is. And I'll never forget it because he looked right into my eyes and he winked and he said, just check. And when he said that, I thought to myself, maybe he knew who he was, but he didn't want to say. I wasn't sure. After that, he said, oh, they want me to tell you one more thing, one more thing. You're very naturally clairvoyant. And I remember thinking to myself then, yeah, right. He tells that to everybody who's new to get them to come back. I just knew he wanted to make that $5 a week off of me. But after that, I went out to the car and I called my mom and I said, hey, I have a question for you. Are we related to anybody with the last name of White? And she was silent for just a second, and then she said, Justin, why do you want to know that? Well, I didn't expect that response, and I didn't know what she would think of me going to something like that at the time, and I didn't have time enough to come up with a good, believable lie. So I just told her the truth, and she said, Justin, I'm not convinced that this is how you came across this information. But she proceeded to tell me that her grandmother, Bessie, the one who came through with the quarter, when she was younger was married, but apparently wasn't a fanatic about it. And during the course of that marriage, she had had an affair. And during the course of that affair, she had become pregnant with my grandmother, who at the time all this happened was still living. Guess what the man's last name was she had the affair with? Yeah, it was White. He was my great grandfather. I had no idea. I never knew he existed, much less ever met him. That was just something not talked about in my family, and still is not really. But that night changed my life, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, Justin, you've just graduated high school, have just had this profoundly life-changing experience. And at that point, I hadn't really lost anybody who was close to me, but I want to be able to do that for people who have. So I went to that class every single week religiously. I entered into seminary, and here we are almost 20 years later. So that's the beginning of it for me. And always remember that your soul is speaking. Are you listening?